Hi there, I'm Cheryl Biswas. You may know me as Encrypted online, and I'm honored to be presenting at Texas Cyber Summit Adversary Village this year. Welcome to my talk today, signed, sealed, delivered, comparing Chinese APTs behind software supply chain attacks. I hope you enjoy. A little bit about me. I'm a threat intel specialist with TD Bank here in Canada. And let me give a shout out to my awesome team. I'm very lucky to get to work with you. I'm a founding member of the Diana Initiative. We support diversity and equality in our field. And I'm so grateful to the terrific staff, volunteers, and supporters who helped make another wonderful event happen this year. I hope that you can all join us live next year. So, obligatory disclaimer. The views expressed here today are mine alone and not those of my employer. In this talk, I want to explain what software supply chain attacks are and the growing threat that they pose. We're going to take a look at how code dependency is a factor, compounded by mistakes and misconfigurations. And then we're going to take a look at the history of some major attacks, especially in terms of state-sponsored actors involved, and talk about who's been watching and what they leverage. Finally, we'll wrap up with what we can do better and some suggestions. We don't fully appreciate just how interconnected we are and how that translates into software code dependencies. It took an event like the SolarWinds Orion attack to rattle the bars on that cage, and to wake us up to what's been going on for some time. The reality is that software supply chain attacks aren't something new. They've been around for many years, and we've been watching that check engine light, but not really addressing the issues. My hope is that the knowledge I share here today can give you some new insights and awareness to go back and better secure your projects. What a year it's been. Even before we got out of the gate, the tone was set. SolarWinds was truly unprecedented. It's the kind of event that we can talk about for decades, that we build and learn from. However, as you're going to see, there have been a lot of software supply chain shenanigans over 2021. It's an abuse of trust, and it's compromise right at the source. It's the insertion of malicious code into legitimate software that gets distributed en masse. And it's the compromise of a single trusted source by adversaries to control the distribution system and deliver malicious updates. Now, this can create access points into the networks of those customers, up to the thousands and tens of thousands, as was demonstrated in SolarWinds Orion. And as we learned, nobody is untouchable. Everyone is a potential target. And the impact? Well, incapacitate, disrupt, sabotage, and per MITRE ATT&CK framework, this is T1195 for initial access. Software supply chain attacks take time, resources, and skills to plan. This is the purview of state-sponsored threat actors, notably Russian or Chinese-backed groups. But both cybercriminal and state-sponsored groups target the technology industry because these companies are relied on by many organizations and individuals, and that can have wide-ranging impact. Now, attacks on tech companies can enable third-party compromise of enterprise customers via software supply chain updates. China has actively targeted tech companies in Taiwan with supply chain attacks because they see Taiwan as a major competitor. Now, an important disclaimer. I'm not a coder or a developer, so I'm not going to pretend to be one. However, I am presenting this talk from my experience as a threat intelligence researcher, and what I do plays a key role because we watch the geopolitics play out, and we reach back for historical context on patterns of behavior, because history repeats. and actions have consequences. Ian Pratt, the global head of security for personal systems at HP, had this to say: whether they are a direct target or a stepping stone to gain access to bigger targets, as we've seen with the upstream supply chain attack against SolarWinds, organizations of all sizes need to be cognizant of this risk. There's nothing like getting some historical context, so let's talk a bit about what's on this timeline. We're going to look at Operation Aurora in 2009, then in 2017, NOTPETYA and CCLEANER. In 2018, there was SHADOWPAD and NetSarang, and in 2019, we'll take a look at Operation SHADOWHAMMER. In 2009, Operation Aurora was a wake-up call when the Chinese state-sponsored group APT-17 Elderwood targeted Google, Adobe, and 34 other companies. They went after them for their source code management systems. Why? To alter the source code. So when we talk about digital crown jewels, we need to be talking about this, because this is at the heart of a software supply chain attack. And if you control the source code, well, imagine what you can do. The attack was sophisticated, and it exploited zero-day vulnerabilities in Internet Explorer. Vulnerabilities were also found in Perforce. That's a source code revision software that was used by Google. Per Dmitry Alperovich, this event led Google to implement zero trust and to track lateral movement and to put in place better infrastructure. Interestingly enough, Google wasn't part of the mass fallout during the SolarWinds Orion event. And then there was NOTPETYA in 2017. This was the work of an elite Russian hacking team known as Sandworm. It's part of the GRU military intelligence service. They compromised and took over software updates of the mandatory accounting software package known as MEDOC, used throughout the Ukraine. It's like TurboTax or Quicken here. Now, Russia has used Ukraine as a cyber petri dish for years to test weaponized cyber weapons in what has been a hostile relationship. Russia has control issues. So Sandworm had been detonating logic bombs in government organizations and companies all over the Ukraine. And in this case, there was Linkos Group. That's a small family-run software business that pushed out the updates to MEDOC. Sandworm hijacked those update servers, and it installed a hidden backdoor to access all the PCs that would get MEDOC. And then in June of 2017, Sandworm effectively pushed the play button to launch NOTPETYA. This was destructive malware. This was a cyber weapon, and it was designed to spread with breathtaking speed, which it did. And when you saw it, the damage had already been done. It leveraged Eternal Blue and Mimikatz for complete control and access. Now, it was supposed to be punitive against the Ukraine, but it spread to infect major corporations like Maersk. As unintended consequences, there was collateral damage, and the costs amounted to $10 billion globally. In January of 2019, a sophisticated supply chain attack was discovered that targeted ASUS by the Chinese threat group APT-17, also known as Barium, and they have been behind a number of software supply chain attacks. What they targeted was the ASUS Live update utility. Now, according to Gartner in 2017, ASUS was the world's 5th largest PC vendor, and that makes it an extremely attractive target for APT groups that might want to take advantage of their user base. So, that is a pre-installed utility on most ASUS computers. It was used to update certain components such as the BIOS, UEFI, drivers, and applications, something that end users would implicitly trust, even welcome the convenience of. And there are a lot of end users. So sabotage developer tools were used to spread the malware swiftly and silently. They modified an old version of the ASUS Live Update Utility software. And then the attackers signed their malware with 2 ASUS digital certifications and stored it on official servers. How would you know? It was pushed out to over 1 million laptops, and that allowed attackers to have control remotely to install more malware. In addition to the ASUS SHADOWHAMMER, they targeted several gaming companies. Nick Weaver, who's a security researcher at University of California's Berkeley International Computer Science Institute, shares this. You're trusting every vendor whose code is on your machine, and you're trusting every vendor's vendor. So we're grappling with the growing sense of complexity in tech. It's not just what corporations deploy in their own environments, but it's how they're incorporating third-party tech. Per Windows Snyder, the product assumes all the security risk of all the components it incorporates. Like I said. So let's talk about our code dependency. The fact is that applications increasingly depend on external software to work. There's proprietary code, open source components, third-party APIs. Modern apps are just too big for one developer to do on their own, and software reuse has become the norm. Popular open source projects are used as dependencies, and these are attractive targets for an attacker to add malicious code to, and then claim the users of those dependencies. So what we need to do is appreciate the increasing complexity of library use in applications, and how the functions of one library rely on a number of other libraries to be implemented. This creates complex dependency trees that developers won't remove or update because of the possible downstream consequences. Let's take a look at some numbers. The average app has 118 open source libraries, and the average library is 2.6 years old. And your average Java app can have as many as 50 open source vulnerabilities. 99% of organizations have at least one or more high-risk Java licenses. And what about false positivity rates when you're using legacy SCA tools to test? Well, Java has 23%, Net has 13%, and Node has 69%. Let's take a look at 4 elements of the software supply chain. There's what you write, which is the custom code you develop in-house. And there's what you build with. Those are your software development tools. There's what you buy, which is off-the-shelf software as a service apps. And there's what you use, third-party libraries. We need to understand the areas of risk around open source libraries and frameworks, which can come from active or inactive libraries or library classes, the age of the library, licensing, and of course, vulnerabilities. And you can bet that our adversaries are understanding this, so it's good for us to learn it too. It's hard to do this, though, when you don't have visibility into which libraries and classes are being used by the software, or when you're only relying on static scans from legacy security code analysis tools that are out of date once that library changes or updates. This is from the 2021 Contrast Labs Open Source Security Report. I know there's a lot to take in here, but the key points are these. If you use open source code, then you need to be paying more attention than you have been. And what we've been doing to identify and remediate risks isn't comprehensive. We're missing stuff. And the legacy security tools in use are not securing us. We've got to level up. Now, this is a timeline of software package repositories that have been involved in supply chain attacks. It's really easy to just get code from various projects online and then incorporate that into other software. And here's the risk. Some of those open source projects are widely used, but they're not well maintained, or they've even been abandoned. Code reuse is a deliberate strategy, but it's seen as a key differentiator for efficiency, innovation, speed in application development, but at the cost of being vulnerable to compromised, off-the-shelf components. Some repurposed code comes from internal repos, but a lot of it comes from open source libraries. Third parties. For an attacker, compromising a software supply chain can be through the manipulation of the application source code, the manipulation of the update or distribution methods, or by replacing compiled releases with a modified version. And the targets can range from a very specific and limited group to a wide number. Well, stuff happens. And that brings us here. The continuous integration, continuous development pipeline, which is a best practice for DevOps to deliver code change frequently and reliably. CI/CD is a coding philosophy and a set of practices to drive development teams to implement small changes and to check in code to version control repositories frequently. It's a consistent, automated way to build, package, and test applications. It sounds good. The thing is, you are using other people's technology and mistakes will be made. In November of 2020, the FBI issued a flash alert warning that threat actors had been actively targeting vulnerable SONARQUBE instances since April to access source code repos and exfiltrate proprietary code of U.S. government agencies and private organizations. Now, the FBI found multiple potential computer intrusions corresponding with leaks associated with the SONARQUBE configuration vulnerabilities that had been exploited since April of 2020. In August of 2020, unknown threat actors leaked internal data from 2 organizations through a public lifestyle repo tool. And they scanned online for exposure via default port 9000, a publicly accessible IP address, and there were default admin creds. Several of those source code repositories also contained hard-coded credentials, which opened the door to accessing other resources and the expansion of the breach. Per Sakar Sarkai, who was writing in the McAfee blog of July 31st, 2020, this is regarding that SONARQUBE source code leak. Because mistakes will be made. So let's talk about several major software supply chain attacks from the past, and about the lessons that perhaps went unlearned. If that looks busy, yes, it is. The Identity Theft Resource Center stated that 137 organizations reported they were impacted by supply chain attacks at 27 different third-party vendors. That's an increase of 42% from the last quarter of 2020. We're going to revisit that a little bit later in the talk. Attackers will manipulate software dependencies and development tools to compromise data or systems before they reach the recipient. And as we've seen, they go after source code. In the case of SolarWinds, Microsoft said that attackers gained access to some of the source code for Exchange, Azure, and Intune. Having that source code can give adversaries the advantage because then they can go look for undiscovered vulnerabilities and be the first to exploit them. The attackers also go after certificates. Stolen code signing certificates let them evade detection and deliver malware payloads as though they come from a legitimate source. And certificate abuse is an ongoing and increasing component in all kinds of attacks. So let's talk about attacks. Well, we've got vendor compromise. That's the most sophisticated. we have exploiting third-party applications, where you find and exploit vulnerabilities, especially 0 days. These bugs can enable an attacker to manipulate the software to do things it was never intended for, like credential theft or accessing information. Exploiting open source libraries. Now, these can also have vulnerabilities to exploit, but unlike software packages, it's harder to update and maintain open source code. Because the source code is openly available, attackers can easily study and practice on it, like Apache Struts 2 framework. That has had 13 critical 0-day disclosures in 5 years. Or there's dependency confusion, and that one we're going to talk about later. There's hostile takeover, and examples from 2018 with EventStream and Node.js, when the original owner had been approached by another community member willing to take over the management of their project. They handed it over in good faith. This isn't an unusual thing. It happens more frequently than you realize. The owner transferred control, and in a few weeks, malicious code was being downloaded via automated build tools and deployed in numerous software applications. This code was designed to steal credentials from Copay Bitcoin wallets, and it was used via encryption. It used to hide its functionality. The stolen credential data was sent to a remote server. Fortunately, some mistakes caught the attention of managers of the Node.js repo, who simply thought that there was a bug in the package. So, here's a lesson about abuse of trust. The assumption that the software supply chain is trustworthy and that anyone can create or contribute without a formal vetting process. Now, this is a good schematic for a plan of attack. We start by injecting malicious code into the dependency tree up at the top. From there, we can create a new package with unexpected features like Trojan horse or typo squatting, or use after free. We can infect an existing package, and from there we can spread all that malicious goodness by injecting it into the source, or into the repository system, or during the build, a la SolarWinds, where it can pwn the build system and taint package downloads. And that brings us to SolarWinds, December 14, 2020. SolarWinds Orion is a trusted network management and monitoring software used by the government, Fortune 500s, Microsoft, FireEye, and nobody knew anything was wrong. It's described as the most significant attack of our time. What's distinctive is the degree of stealth, the ability of the attackers to conceal their actions, and the length of time it took for discovery. This was an operation that took time and precision to do, the recon, sophistication to tailor it, and patience. The attackers targeted and compromised the software build environment and code signing infrastructure for Orion. They modified the source code to add a backdoor, and they signed it. They leveraged the existing software release management system, and they used stolen certificates to laterally move through chains of trust. Now, while this has been attributed to Russian threat actors, there was another piece of malware discovered in there that was supplied by Chinese threat actors. It had nothing to do with the original attack, but they took advantage of it. Now, this attack, dependency confusion, is very interesting. Security researcher Alex Burson shone a bright light on a scary possibility. He took a hypothesis about a supply chain substitution attack, where a software installer script is tricked into pulling malicious code from a public repository instead of getting the intended file with the same name from an internal repository. Then he targeted Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, and 32 other companies to execute the unauthorized code inside of their networks to show how it worked. Within 48 hours of publication, though, a lot of other parties thought that it was a good idea too. And without permission, they targeted more companies in March, including Amazon and Slack, Lyft, and Zillow. Here's the issue. Existing dependency scanners typically don't detect if a dependency executes malicious code, since those tools are limited to identifying dependencies with known vulnerabilities. So this prompted a study by researchers at Red Hunt Labs. And what did they find? That 93 repositories out of the top 1,000 GitHub organizations are using a package that doesn't exist on a public package index, which can be claimed by an attacker to cause a supply chain attack. 169 repositories were found to be installing dependencies from a host that isn't reachable over the internet. 126 repositories were installing packages owned by a GitHub or GitLab user that doesn't exist. And of the top 1,000 organizations scanned, 212 had at least one dependency confusion-related misconfiguration in their codebase. This matters because, according to the researcher, much of the open source ecosystem depends on these giants, and we know that these repositories have a lot of users. Hence, if any of their projects get affected, there's a high probability that millions of users will be at risk. Xcode Spy. This is a malicious project that will affect the free application development environment. So, in March of 2021, new malware variants were observed targeting iOS developers in a supply chain attack to install a backdoor on a developer's computer. And threat actors used a legitimate development environment created by Apple. This fooled the victims into adding an online project to their application that would compromise their systems in, of course, a supply chain attack. The point here? Attackers are actively targeting developers. They're looking for those shared sites, the repositories where code is uploaded for use by others. And it's a common behavior by developers to share their projects online with other users. It's an abuse of trust. CodeCov is an online platform that's used for hosting code testing reports and statistics, and it provides developers with tools to help them quantify just how much source code gets executed during testing. They serve more than 29,000 customers globally, and many of those are enterprise level. They include GoDaddy, Atlassian, Royal Bank of Canada, Procter & Gamble. But the impact went beyond that to thousands of public development projects, including Ansible, Kubernetes, PyTest, and Radar.org. As well, Twilio, Rapid7, and the e-commerce platform Mercari were all victims. So on April 1st of 2021, CodeCov reported a supply chain attack that had actually occurred back in late January. What happened was this. Attackers leveraged an error in the process that creates CodeCov's Docker image, and this allowed for them to extract credentials which protect the modification of the bash uploader script. Now, that's a tool used by the customers to send code coverage reports to the platform. The script was modified to deliver details from customer environments to a server outside of CodeCov, and attackers could export credentials, tokens, or keys that pass through CodeCov's continuous integration environment, and then they could use those to access services and data stores or application code. What were you doing on the July long weekend this year? Well, a lot of us were responding to this. On July the 2nd, Revel ransomware operators delivered a fake VSA update sending a ransomware payload from compromised VSA servers to VSA agents that were running on managed Windows devices. KASEYA is an IT solutions developer for managed services providers and enterprise-level organizations. Over 40,000 reportedly use a KASEYA product. And they offer VSA, which is a unified remote monitoring and management tool for networks and endpoints. it has a high level of trust on customer devices. So much so that attached clients will do whatever they are told. And therefore, it's likely one of the reasons that KASEYA was targeted. The malicious update was dubbed KASEYA VSA Agent Hotfix. Initial access came from exploited zero-day vulnerabilities in KASEYA's VSA software and was leveraged against a number of MSPs. The attack was triggered via an authentication bypass vulnerability in the KASEYA VSA web interface. Now, this allowed the attackers to circumvent authentication controls, gain an authenticated session, and then upload a malicious payload. And then they executed commands via SQL injection to achieve code execution in the process. They attempted to disable Microsoft Defender using a signed certificate. So, trust issues? That hotfix was already good to go thanks to anti-malware software exclusions that had been set up for KASEYA. The current tally is at about 50 KASEYA direct customers and anywhere between 800 to 1,500 small to medium-sized businesses along that chain were infected, some of whom were not directly KASEYA's customers. These are companies that don't have the financial or people resources that enterprise organizations do to tackle a ransomware attack. So let's talk about who maximizes these opportunities. Of all the state-sponsored adversaries, Chinese cyber espionage groups have been and will continue to be the biggest threat to tech, conducting economic espionage and intellectual property theft. Technology companies are rich targets just on their own, but these groups leverage them to infect supply chains to go after the customers, and they are the leaders of the pack in terms of attacks and capabilities. This is from the report Broken Trust, issued by the Atlantic Council in 2021. There have been 36 other cases of intruders successfully targeting software updates from 138 recorded supply chain attacks and vulnerability disclosures. Of these 36, 15 had similar access to build or update the infrastructure, and half of those 15 could be attributed to nation-states. If you want to try mapping APTs to government and military in China, I found this work already in progress by Anastasios Pingios, so I'm going to share the link here. Okay. These are some of the most well-known supply chain attacks involving Chinese state-sponsored threat actors. Now, while Russian adversaries are formidable, you really don't want Chinese APTs in your network. They play the long game better than anybody. They are masters of stealth, and they are ruthlessly dedicated to eliminating the competition. An attack was discovered in February of 2017 that targeted an administrative software package known as Evlog. It was made by Altair Technologies, a Canadian software company. This was a software supply chain intrusion that targeted enterprise organizations globally. It included military organizations and defense contractors. This is something that China cares deeply about developing and surpassing the West at. There were also banks and universities, and some of these were major telecom providers. It was a very impressive client list. Are you thinking SolarWinds? You should be, because several years later, and it's not known how many of these customers were and could still be compromised. And why Evlog? Because the users were mostly system and domain admins. So that offered excellent access to targeted networks after initial compromise. CCLEANER. This one's been linked to APT-17, and more specifically, a subgroup known as Axiom, who have historically engaged in supply chain attacks. The CCLEANER attack showcases technical knowledge, preparation, and patience. We talked about that earlier. and the timing was strategically advantageous because the original owner, Piriform, was in the process of selling to Avast. There's a lot of distraction and confusion during a sale, and it's easy to miss things in the network that don't belong there. The attackers took their time to move laterally in the network during off hours to avoid detection, and in a month they'd installed a modified version of SHADOWPAD backdoor malware to escalate their privileges. Then they distributed a cryptographically signed version of the modified CCLEANER product. No one suspected a thing. The initial compromise came through accessing an unattended workstation of a CCLEANER developer connected to the Piriform network via TeamViewer Remote. They reused credentials from previous data breaches to access that TeamViewer account, and they delivered malware using VBScript. They developed a malicious version then of the CCLEANER product, and they used RDP to open a backdoor on a second unattended connected computer. There they dropped binary and malicious payload of second stage malware that was delivered to 40 CCLEANER users. They compiled customized versions of the SHADOWPAD backdoor to allow for further malicious downloads and data theft in preparation for their third stage, which they then installed. And that malicious version had multi-stage malware payloads to steal the data and then send it back to the command and control server. This was very likely data theft for espionage purposes. Now in APT-17, also known as Barium, had delivered SHADOWPAD malware to infect enterprise networks via a product known as NetSarang. NetSarang specializes in server management and security connectivity software used by major organizations globally. Where have we heard this before? A module was hidden in a code library, which was making suspicious DNS requests and sending data back to the operators, who then decided if they wanted to go ahead. Then they would send a malware payload with a full backdoor to take over the system. We talked about SHADOWHAMMER earlier, but just to reiterate, this attack illustrates a massive abuse of trust through the delivery of malware in a modified older version of the ASUS Live update software. Signed, sealed, delivered. Chinese APT group Lucky Mouse went after chat software that was used by the Mongolian government agencies and businesses. They hijacked the updates in the software supply chain. The attackers did not need to steal or forge an update signature because Abel's updates were not signed. Now, Operation Sign Sight happened in the summer of 2020. The Vietnamese Government Certificate Authority was a target of a software supply chain intrusion that targeted a wide range of public and private entities. And they used the digital signature software, which provides certificates of validation and software suites to handle digital document signatures. This software is used widely throughout Vietnam, and it's mandated in some cases. A key point here, the attackers were targeting trust and abusing it. They were leveraging a service oligopoly. Now, this is believed to have been the work of a Chinese state-sponsored group, likely or believed to be TA-428, and they're known for targeting East Asian countries, including Mongolia and Vietnam. This one's very interesting. Golden Spy malware was embedded in required tax payment software that was issued to corporations who wanted to conduct business operations in China. The Chinese banks required businesses to install something known as intelligence tax to pay the local taxes, and it's produced by the Golden Tax Department of the Iceno Corporation. Does this sound familiar? A little bit like what happened with NotPetya, perhaps? The malware installed a backdoor on systems, which enabled a remote threat actor to execute Windows commands or upload and execute any binary, including ransomware, Trojans, etc. The malware provided system-level privileges with the capability to execute any software on the system where it's installed, and it was connected to a command and control server that was distinct from the TAC's software network infrastructure. So where do we go from here? There is a new executive order, and that's a great starting point. But the picture is far bigger than we realize. Package management. It's an ongoing challenge, and it can be done better. A registry of record will help us to improve reliability in the chain. Eric Sheehan of Symantec, who was integral in helping investigate and decode Stuxnet, says that this is like finding a needle in a haystack. To have the right security telemetry and visibility at the right control points in your organization. So here are some takeaways. We need to be paying more attention to the open source code that we use. It's time to change what we've been doing to identify and remediate risks because we're missing things. Those legacy security tools in use aren't really securing us. I'm going to share a new product called SIGSTORE with you, and also something known as Package Hunter, because we need to level up. So SIGSTORE is from the Linux Foundation, and it seeks to empower software developers to securely sign their software artifacts, release files, container images, binaries, bills of material, manifests, etc. The signing materials get stored in a tamper-resistant public log of all activity for accountability of every submission, and it's free for use by all developers and software providers. Package Hunter is a new tool from GitLab that you can use to detect malicious code and not the behavior that you're perhaps expecting in your dependencies, because there are a lot of malicious packages in the wild. This is free and open source. And so I'll end with this. I love podcasts. One of my favorites is a go-to for me, Risky Business. They had an excellent segment about Operation AURORA, featuring Mark Rogers from Okta, whom I've referenced a few times in here and will again now. So, if you can gain a position of trust, you can exploit it. Think service or non-person IDs, accounts that nobody really scrutinizes, with enough privilege to leverage, and then to do e-discovery and find all of the stuff that you need for an attack. Your chain is only as good as its weakest link, and there are more ways to abuse the chain of trust than people realize. Thank you so much for your time, for attending my talk, and happy Halloween.